My name is Nicolas Jofre, and I am here with the founder of Query on Inc., Mark Thompson, and over the course of the next hour or so, we're going to be having a conversation about Mark's upcoming book and also about our organization, Query on Inc. Mark, thank you for making the time for being here with me in this new experience of podcasting. I'll start by talking a little bit about you, if you don't mind.
Please.
So, you have lived many lives. You served in the Peace Corps in Tunisia, earned the first PhD in public policy ever conferred at Harvard. And then you worked as a real estate investor. And your academic work has focused on decision science and game theory. In your two most recent books, you applied those methods to military decisions during World War II. Through all of this, you've also been interested in the question of corruption in American government. And you founded our nonprofit organization, which is dedicated to researching the influence of money in politics and in government. And we'll talk about the organization later. But can you tell us about where the idea for this book came from and why it felt important for you to write this story?
Sure. Let me first just mildly correct one of the things that you just said. I am not the founder of the tiny charitable corporation that you and I are both members of, but I am a founder, along with my business partners. Where did the idea of this book come from? I would give primary credit to Charles Lewis, known as Chuck Lewis to his friends. Chuck wrote a number of terrific books suggestive of corruptive possibilities in American government. He wrote, for instance, a series of Buying of the President books, 1996 through 2004. He was the lead author on a similar book, The Buying of the Congress. Each of these books detailed the lists of campaign contributions made to various candidates for these offices. In addition, I was fortunate to have had a number of personal conversations with Chuck Lewis. He and I both thought it might be a useful complement to his several books if I were to write a book that gave a bit of a historical perspective on corruptive possibilities in American government. And we both agreed one of the most notorious episodes of governmental corruption in the history of our country is what has been known as the Tweed Ring, a cabal of Manhattan politicians who reigned supreme in New York City from 1863 to 1871.
Is it fair to say that this book is different than the traditional scholarship that you have done?
I would say it's quite different. My two previous books were the applications of decision science and game theory to a specific set of battle decisions in the Second World War. And this is fairly different, although I do apply decision science in one of the sections of this book. Decision scientists, as a rule, are dismayed at the denial of uncertainty by most human beings. Historians fall into that. Many historians, including historians of William Tweed, have been in uncertainty denial.
Let's turn to the story that I was not familiar with prior to reading the book. I did not know about this period in history. What is most fascinating about the content is the very obvious parallels between Tweed's operation, the operation of many other bosses who came after, and what we're seeing with the federal government currently. I wonder if you could describe who this man is and why this matters.
Well, I have many friends who are very smart, and I find that about half of them know who William Tweed was and what the Tweed Ring was. William Tweed was born on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, 1823, and he was a gregarious fellow, sort of a natural politician. He had been elected to the United States Congress, where he served one term. And the reason that he only saved one term is he afterwards said that he was frankly bored sitting around and listening to a bunch of snoozers discuss possible contracts. So in 1855, he returned to Manhattan. And over the next 16 years, in the opinion of A majority of historians, he amassed more political power than any previous urban politician in New York City or any other city on earth ever had. And it wasn't just political power. He was said to have boasted that in his prime, he was worth $20 million. And we translate that to the money of 2025, we're talking about $500 million that Tweed was able to pull into himself, all while a public employee. Needless to say, eyebrows were raised as to how a public employee could make $20 million.
You make the case that at least in Tweed's case, there seems to be a tradition of this kind of form of government in American politics.
Yes.
And so let's start off by describing the sort of setting that gives rise to a character like Tweed and to the machine that he built. So I'll start off by highlighting there's a Portuguese phrase from Brazil that translates to, I steal, but I get things done. The point of the phrase is the notion that there are times in a society where conditions are so challenging for segments of folks that they are willing to put up with a substantial amount of corruption as long as they see some benefit to themselves, which in many cases is just meeting basic needs of the population. And so let's talk a little bit about the conditions in New York.
There were more Germans in New York City in 1865 than in any other city on earth other than Vienna and Berlin. When Tweed began to be attacked by the press of New York City, the New York Times was coming out with special editions in German because the German faction was so large. Tweed came to power. His political power arose from and through Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall had been huge in New York City even before Tweed became a member. Tammany Hall was especially good at winning the allegiance and the votes of immigrants. The Tammany Hall was largely within the Democratic Party, but also had opponent party token membership. The main opposition party in the early years, say the 1840s, were the Whigs, and the Whigs in New York City were not particularly interested in making immigrants happy and even securing the votes of the immigrants. So Tammany had a free hand, and by the time Tweed became paramount in Tammany Hall, Tammany already had overwhelmingly the allegiance and the votes of the immigrants, the Irish and the Germans in Manhattan.
Can you talk a little bit about why that was? So what services did Tammany Hall provide in exchange for that allegiance?
There's a terrific movie. Martin Scorsese was the director. The name of the movie is The Gangs of New York. And Scorsese has a scene in that movie that answers your question better than I can, Nicholas. Basically, it shows William Tweed greeting the immigrant arrivals in New York City and telling them that he will help them to settle, he will find them jobs, and don't forget to vote Tammany. That's basically how Tweed and Tammany Hall amassed power. Terrific retail political operations, doing important favors, especially for the immigrants over the years. Those immigrants, as a result, voted overwhelmingly for the candidates of Tammany Hall.
It does remind us of Trump's ascendance over the course of the past 10 years, where the angle has really been about helping the working person, and the resonance that he has had, like Tweed, is really built on, I see you, I recognize your struggles, and I'm here to help you. Tweed's operation is focused on helping individuals, but his primary goal is just amassing power. And I wonder if you can describe his ascendance through politics and how they
Yes.
built an incredibly sophisticated operation where at his height he had a very formalized system for securing votes, then securing his friends in positions of power.
Well, Tweed had his ups and downs. I mean, as I said, at the age of 29, he was elected to the U.S. Congress, which shows he was a pretty successful politician. But then he returned to Manhattan and found he lost many of his political contacts. He ran again for his previous post as an alderman and was resoundingly defeated. So in 1855, he was basically a chairmaker. He had to start all over again. In 1860, he decided that he was doing well enough as a politician. He had a number of minor posts, like he was there were 12 supervisors of the county of New York. The county of New York had exactly the same boundaries as the city of New York, and the two governments sometimes overlapped and got confused. He was one of 12 supervisors of the county of New York. He had been a school commissioner. He had a number of minor offices like that made him enough money that in 1860, he decided he could leave chairmaking behind. So he and his brother declared bankruptcy. There's some ethical questions about that bankruptcy. Some of his biographers believe that he had enough assets to fully repay all of his creditors. But anyhow, in 1860, he declared bankruptcy. And 11 years later, he was worth, as he said, $20 million. How did that happen? A main step is that in 1863, with the help of his number one political ally, Peter Sweeney, they were often considered to be paired shot callers within Tammany Hall. Tweed was, in 1863, elected the chairman of the Tammany Hall General Committee. This meant that he and Sweeney controlled the choices of candidates, not just for legislators within New York City, but also for judicial positions. So they had a number of judges who owed their judgeships to the support of Tweed and Sweeney. As a result, they tended to make their rulings to be whatever Sweeney and Tweed wanted them to rule. Tweed's power grew through the 1860s until in the late 1860s, he was elected to the Senate of New York State. He had gone 15 years between significant electoral victories. From his election to Congress back, he didn't have a single noteworthy electoral victory. He wasn't a charismatic speaker. People didn't rush to the polls to vote for him, but as his power became more paramount, he did have a number of people that would vote for him. In early 1870, there was significant resentment within the Democratic Party of how powerful and rich both Tweed and Sweeney had become. So there was a significant revolt against the two of them within the Democratic Party of Manhattan. And Tweed was able to beat off this challenge to his supremacy within the Democratic Party of Manhattan. The contest boiled down to competing charters for the city of New York. A major theme was that almost all New Yorkers resented the fact that they didn't control their own city. There had been notorious scandals in the city in the 1850s, and as a result, the upstate Republicans decided New Yorkers could not be trusted. The upstate Republicans basically did in the 1850s was to make the city of New York essentially the protected and dictated to ward of the upstate Republicans. And basically all citizens of Manhattan resented that, and Tweed decided that he would kill two birds with one stone. He would pass a charter that would restore home rule to Manhattan. At the same time, in the same charter, he would demolish the opposition to himself and Sweeney within the Democratic Party. How did he do this? How do you think he did this, Nicholas?
He paid for it?
You nailed it, yeah. Nicholas. He paid for it. Do you have any guess what the price might have been?
Cheaper than we might expect.
I don't know. It depends on what our expectations are. But in any case, the later estimate, and this was testified under oath by Tweed himself, he said he laid out $1 million in Albany to bribe the various legislators to pass his city charter instead of the competing city charter of his opponents within the Democratic Party.
And that actually included several instances when he did bribe his opposition.
Oh, yes.
So it wasn't just bribing his affiliates, but actually going to the opposing party and saying, what's the price tag? And we'll make it happen.
Under oath, he testified that he had an advisor on how to win over fellow Democrats, but he relied on others for advice on how to win over Republicans. And the best advice he could get on the latter issue was there's 5 key Republicans, and what you do is you give a total of $200,000 to these 5 Republicans, $40,000 apiece. Tweed was a clever guy. One of his ideas was he wouldn't give $40,000 apiece to each of the 5. He would give to one of the 5 who would then distribute to the other 4. And that way, 4 of the 5 could truthfully say that they never took a penny from William Tweed. The total price was estimated to be $1 million, at least $200,000 to the Republicans. Tweed was able to pass his charter. And the New York Times, which later would be a major journalistic opponent of the Tweed ring, in the spring of 1870 was ecstatic that Tweed had passed his charter. They wrote editorials saying that Senator Tweed has now distinguished himself as a genuine reformer.
That was because that granted authority
Overwhelmingly
to the. Do you think they understood the level of corruption happening, or did they not have a sense of the mechanism used to achieve that?
Well, they should have understood.
It seemed like he had a reputation even by then.
Smart, very capable people had written many pieces indicating that New York City, as run by Tweed and Sweeney, was one huge corrupt enterprise. But it seems that the New York Times earlier had been critical of the Tweed ring. But in the spring of 1870, with the passage of the Tweed Charter, it seemed the New York Times was substantially in the bag of the Tweed ring. One of the directors of the New York Times actually had joined Tweed in a number of business ventures. That man died in August of 1870, and within 2 months, the editorial position of the New York Times had turned around 180 degrees, from singing the praise of the Tweed ring to, in the fall of 1870, coming out very strongly against all of Tammany's candidates for offices in the elections of 1870. However, in those elections, New York Times and all of their allies were singularly unsuccessful. The Republican government under Ulysses Grant had taken a number of measures to make sure that corruption in the elections of Manhattan that year would be substantially clamped down on. The Republicans thought they were in a terrific position to sweep those elections. Well, they got the sweep part right. They were the ones who were swept. The Tweed ring candidate for mayor, a man by the name of Oakey Hall, won re-election. The Tweed ring candidate for governor of New York State, John Hoffman, was also handily elected. This led to the 6 months that have been considered the apogee of the power of the ring of William Tweed, the first 6 months of 1871.
So can you describe a little bit the extent of his power at that point? Can you give people a sense of it? The thing that I struggle to do is get a sense of how that might look if we were to apply it to current New York City government, what it might look like if somebody had that amount of power. Could you describe everything that he controlled?
Well, I think it would take a week to describe everything that he controlled, but let me take an instance or two. In the late 1860s, what is now the borough of Brooklyn, they wanted there to be a bridge between Brooklyn and Manhattan. They badly wanted a bridge. Manhattan didn't want the bridge nearly as badly as the Brooklynites did. The question for Brooklyn was what to do in the late 1870s to get Manhattan to commit to paying $1.5 million for the construction of the bridge. What should the Brooklynites do? What would you do if you were a Brooklynite?
Well, I would call up Tweed.
That was yes. You are totally in sync with the Brooklynites of the late 1860s.
Mm-hmm.
They saw the problem and they saw the solution. The solution was William Tweed. Tweed went across the East River to Brooklyn, and he explained to the Brooklynites the solution. He basically said, "Give me $60,000, distribute this money strategically within the government among the councilmen and the assemblymen, the aldermen of Manhattan, and I will get them to vote for the construction of this bridge. When constructed, it would be the largest suspension bridge on Earth." Tweed also said, in addition to the money to bribe the other guys, I want special considerations for myself and other members of the Tweed Ring. I want you to sell me at deeply discounted prices shares in the entity that is constructing the Brooklyn Bridge, rested upon his ability to allocate jobs among various constituents and voters within Manhattan. He said, I want you guys to give me and my fellow ring members substantial say in the hiring of thousands of laborers in the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge. And that's how it happened. The members of the government in Manhattan were bribed. Tweed and his other ring members made a lot of money themselves. They gained control over many jobs, and the bridge got built.
This is going back to the notion the guy gets stuff done, right? And a great example is he successfully secures the land for the construction of the Met.
Yes,
and so New York,
correct.
Among many other similar examples. So it turns out that he really shapes New York positively in many ways, or at least he makes significant contributions to the city, which goes to the point that there is a certain amount of forgiveness that people have or a willingness to ignore the obvious corruption as long as they see the works actually happening. The problem, of course, is that in addition to the many illegal things that he does, there seems to be a significant profit motive. One of the common tactics that he uses is that if for every political favor he provides, he earns himself. So he becomes a director in many different companies.
Yes.
And this is part of the approach that he uses to amass his wealth. I want to turn to the psychology of a character like him. You provide in the book examples of bosses that have followed a similar trajectory. I think we are all pretty familiar with what the template looks like for this kind of person. Just thinking, what drives this person? He seems to have some respect for the city and public works, but at the same time, he's a deeply egotistical man who is very materialistic. He wears a diamond. The funniest detail is that he has a picture of himself on his desk. I wonder if you could describe the psychology of such a person, because I do think there's something about that psychology that enables this model.
My short answers are that it was very much about power, but yes, he also cared.
Right?
I mean,
It seems that way.
there were a number of instances cited in the book where he was laying out a lot of himself and his own money to help the disadvantaged citizens of Manhattan.
And he keeps a pretty good pulse on what they need also,
Yes,
which is an evolving thing. It's not a static thing.
yes. I mean, one of the primary characteristics of successful bosses is that they are terrific at understanding what motivates voting behavior. And so Tweed and virtually every other successful political boss in this country and elsewhere has to be good at figuring out how to get votes. He was great at that.
The paradox is that somebody who has some amount of empathy for the voting class also probably wouldn't want to be wearing a massive diamond on himself all the time. And so there is sort of this fractured
Yes.
psychology of this person.
He definitely made a mistake in not just wearing that diamond, but in purchasing for himself and his family. He had 10 children, a huge luxurious mansion on Fifth Avenue in New York City. And you definitely get, when the reform community basically mobilized itself to kick Tweed out of power, time and again, you hear the New York's upper class protesting against these new arrivals who are living in luxurious mansions. Tweed made the mistake. I think he was terrific at understanding many of the needs of the lower classes. He seems to have not understood the extent and how dangerous to him personally it would be through alienation of the elite in Manhattan by such conspicuous consumption.
This is where hopefully the book does provide some hope in that justice eventually comes. Perhaps not to the extent that he likely deserved, and certainly not yielding the kinds of reforms that would be necessary. But the end of his life is not happy. Can you describe a little bit about the collapse that happened?
One of the things that happened then was that Tweed's oldest daughter was married, and it was probably the grandest wedding that had ever been held in the United States. The wedding gifts were estimated to be worth $700,000, $1871. They got something like 70 sets of silver. They compared the wedding of Tweed's oldest daughter to the most recent wedding of a daughter of Queen Victoria, and they decided that Tweed's daughter got much more. Tweed was doing terrifically at that time, but Tweed had made two mistakes. One, he had lived too grandly, which antagonized a lot of people, and two, he and his fellow ring members hadn't been sufficiently careful as to who had control of the evidence of their thefts from the monies of New York City. And so there were a couple deaths that contributed to the downfall of the Tweed ring. I mentioned the death of a director of the New York Times in 1870, but it was the next January that one of the primary bagmen of the Tweed ring, the clerk of New York City, a man by the name of James Watson, loved to race his sleighs at high speed through Central Park. In January of 1871, he had an accident. He got kicked in the head by one of his horses, and it seemed that he would soon die. He did indeed soon die, but the Tweed ring made the mistake of bringing in somebody to the accountancy departments of the city who would have documentary evidence of the thefts.
They kept really good accounting.
Well, I hope our audience realizes that you're being totally sarcastic there. They did the kind of accounting that recently has been done in Mozambique. There was recently a finance minister was indicted for hiding $1 billion worth of secret loans to the government. The accounting of the city of New York in the prime time of Tweed was statutorily mandated to be periodically reported to all citizens. Statutorily required, maybe, but in practice, did it happen? No. The controller of the finances of the city of New York was a prominent member of the Tweed ring, a man by the name of Richard Connolly, and he basically didn't disclose much at all to the citizens of New York. When he finally was forced to come up with some sort of accounting in August of 1871, nobody could figure out the total debts of New York City. Some thought it was $75 million. Some thought it was $125 million. In any case, it was a huge number. The accountants who came in after the death of James Watson brought detailed notes from the financial records of the city of New York to the New York Times. And the New York Times in July of 1871 began publishing these. And New York voters who had been sort of blasé about the suspected crimes of the ring, it was like you said, the attitude of the Brazilians. In the elections of 1870, the voters of New York City essentially said, yes, he robs, but he gets things done. I think we'll vote for him and all of his buddies. And they did in November of 1870. 8 months later, New York City citizens of all stripes were outraged at the details that the New York Times was publishing. Day after day, the New York Times was publishing details like the man who was the designated plasterer for the Tweed courthouse that was then under construction and way over budget. The plasterer, a man by the name of Andrew Garvey, was paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for a couple days' work. And so the general sense of corruption in the previous fall hadn't kept people from voting for the Tweed ring. But these specifics in July of 1871 seem to have overwhelmingly enraged the citizens of Manhattan, with the result that in November, the Tweed Ring was voted out of power.
And that's something that feels different than the current moment, because I believe that the trust in institutions like the New York Times now is very different than it would have been at that moment. It seems that the population really saw these reports as an authority on what was actually happening and believed them and was outraged. I don't believe that would operate similarly today. I think that's a different kind of challenge. The other thing that happened is there is a certain amount of riling up of people that Harper's Weekly was doing as well.
Yes.
And this is the crucial thing about that, which I think there are some interesting clues about our current moment. Much of the population in New York may not have been able to read at that time, or at least some part of the immigrant population. The crucial thing that Harper's Weekly cartoons did is that it introduced this concept of corruption to a population that otherwise wouldn't have had the same impact on them. And so that's the thing that's happening simultaneously, is that this cartoonist is poking fun of him essentially, and it seems to be irritating Tweed quite a bit that these cartoons are coming up. And as you say, the deaths had a big part in it, allowed a certain amount of crucial information to get out into the world, and suddenly people thought it important to do something about this. So then he ends up in jail initially.
Yes.
But then he leaves jail. But then he ends up back in jail again. So it seemed like the judicial system did work to a certain extent, but I wonder to what degree that was empowered by the public outcry, or whether that kind of judicial result would have happened anyway.
Well, if you read many of the histories of the Tweed Ring and contemporary accounts, the fact that the verdict of guilty eventually came down on Tweed was somewhat surprising. Tweed and Sweeney controlled probably every single judicial appointment in Manhattan. They had judges backing them, and they also stacked the juries. One of his primary opponents said that for years there was not a single jury in Manhattan that had not been packed by Tweed and his allies. So it was widely assumed that even after the indictment of Tweed, there was no possible way he could be convicted.
Right.
A man by the name of Samuel Tilden, a Democrat, reaped more political advantage from the bringing down of the Tweed Ring and the eventual jailing of Tweed than any other human being. Samuel Tilden was elected President of the United States of America in 1876. Now, you might wonder at that, since his name does not appear among the lists of presidents of the United States. Why is that? Well, according to Franklin Roosevelt, with a majority of historians in agreement, the election of 1876 was stolen away from Samuel Tilden by a cabal of Republicans. Back to the judicial proceedings, Tilden was a terrific lawyer, a terrific political organizer. And what he did is he organized teams of lawyers to vet all potential jurors. They had a judge in both of Tweed's trials who was extremely anti-Tweed. The man's name was Noah Davis. And so finally, in November of 1873, Tweed was never convicted of theft. His crime was that he had stolen, but statutes were hard to apply to Tweed, so Tweed was convicted for, quote unquote, a failure to adequately audit. What his charter in 1870 had done had put him and his ring buddies in charge of auditing many of the expenditures of the city of New York, and it was many of the thefts from the Treasury of New York were supposed to have been audited by three members of the Tweed Ring. Obviously didn't do a very good job of auditing because millions of dollars was stolen from the city of New York and ended up in the bank accounts of William Tweed and others. And what Tilden did is he prevailed on the banks in New York City to link up, for instance, every time the complicit plasterer was paid a couple $100,000, the figure was 24% of what the plasterer contractor was paid ended up in the bank account of William Tweed. And this was stressed by the lawyers and the judge in the trial of Tweed, that Tweed had received more than $1 million of such payments. how the judge said to the jury, can we have honesty in government if we allow people like this to get away with crimes like this? The judge basically told the jury that they should convict. They voted to convict, and Tweed went to jail. But there are great dangers in seeing this as a morality tale along the lines of if you do bad things like William Tweed, bad things are going to happen to you. Tweed claimed to have amassed a fortune of $20 million. What happened to that money? Did any of it get recovered by the city of New York?
No, he starts spreading it to his family prior to going to
And
jail.
he had 10 kids, and those 10 kids did very well. The city of New York recovered a lot of money from one of the bagmen. It recovered, well, who was Tweed's number two? Tweed's closest political ally was Peter Sweeney. If Tweed stole $20 million, it appears that Sweeney must have stolen $8 million. What happened to Sweeney? Well, Sweeney was a very clever guy, and he worked out a deal with the city of New York. He would pay the city of New York $400,000. Sweeney fled to Canada and then to Europe. But after working out this deal, $400,000 to cover his theft of at least $8 million, Sweeney returned to New York City. He lived in New York City, probably quite well off given all the money he'd stolen. He lived in New York City until 1911. If you look at political machine after political machine in the United States, I think it is safe to say that perhaps the majority of them never were soundly spanked by the governments.
Not an entirely hopeful end to the story, I guess. Hopeful in the sense that the crimes were brought to light, I suppose.
Yes.
And I think hopefully that gives people enough of a reason to reform the institutions themselves. And let's switch to talking about reform and to talking about Query on Ink. So it is a very pessimistic story. And, you know, I think the point of the Tweed book is largely that many of the same dynamics that were at play with Tweed and many of the things that he did are things that have persisted, things that we continue to see. You could see that as a pessimistic story, and yet you decide to spend some of your time thinking about reform through Query on Ink. Query on Ink was founded in 2008 by you and your business partners. The idea is to try to quantify the total impact that money in politics has had on our nation and make that as tangible as possible to the individual citizen. So how much has it costed to an average person that there has been such an overwhelming capture of our institutions by the private sector? In the current moment, I would categorize the potential for hope and reform in a couple of different buckets. There are the academics that are thinking about our government. There are reform-oriented nonprofits. There is the press. I suppose there's the public. And so I wonder where you see hope.
All of the sectors that you would name, I was and would continue to be hopeful of. Unfortunately, to a significant extent, those hopes have been disappointed. You and another member of our little corporation, a member of our research board, Alan Cohen, who is the editor of the Millbank Quarterly, you and Alan did, in my opinion, an outstanding outreach to the political science community of American academics. And it resulted in Query on Ink having supported an excellent chapter on fundraising by congressional candidates by a professor at UC Irvine named Daniel Thompson. But it had been our hope that either the economists or the political scientists could be motivated to come up with at least a ballpark estimate of how much harm is being done to the United States Treasury and to the individual citizens as a result of policy favors done by elected politicians to make those who contributed to their political campaigns happy. And what maybe The most notorious instance of this occurred before you were born, back in the 1980s. You ever hear of the Keating Five?
No.
Okay. What happened in the late 1980s was that savings and loans were tremendously over-audacious in their lending. And in particular, one savings and loan, the Lincoln Savings and Loan located in Irvine, California, was overextended. And the United States government, an arm of the United States government, the Federal Home Loan Agency, said, wait a minute, you guys don't have sufficient financial soundness. The federal government is providing deposit insurance for all of your depositors, making those deposits because they know that they're federally guaranteed deposits. The federal board, headed by Irwin, wanted to look into the financial status of Lincoln Savings and Loan and a number of other savings and loan. Well, what do you do if you're Charles Keating, who is basically the owner of Lincoln Savings and Loan? If you have no moral scruples and you don't want to be looked at too hard by the appropriate federal agency. What Charles Keating did was to make political campaign donations totaling $1.3 million to 5 men who became elected United States senators. In the spring of 1987, when the United States government is questioning the financial soundness of these institutions where it's guaranteeing the savings for all depositors, you call a meeting. You call in Irwin, the head of the Federal Regulatory Board, and you call in all 5 United States senators to whom you've made fairly substantial campaign contributions. Irwin and his board are basically scared off of their further investigations. They cease all investigations of Lincoln Savings and Loan. Okay, what happened, and it shouldn't have been much of a surprise to anybody who had been following this at all, was that 2 years later, in 1989, Lincoln Savings and Loan went belly up. What was the cost to the government of the United States of America? The answer is $3.5 billion.
Whoa.
So basically, for $1.3 million, Charles Keating had bullied the federal government into a situation where the price tag was more than $30 billion. The total price tag for the collapse of many savings and loans nationwide in the 1980s has been estimated at something like $160 billion. It's also felt that substantial economic downturns in the next few years were substantially caused by the gigantic failures of savings and loan institutions in the United States. Keating was sent to jail. He served 5 years. The number one recipient of his political campaign donations was a California senator by the name of Alan Cranston, and he was reprimanded by the United States Senate. They considered a more serious judgment, namely one of censure, but he declared that he was not going to run for re-election and he had very serious cancer. So they decided to reprimand instead of censor him. He did not run for office again. But the $160 billion that the federal government had to write checks for because of the savings and loan debacle on a nationwide scale is some indicator of just how much harm might be caused by political campaign donations. For $1.3 million in political campaign donations to his own institution, Charles Keating was able to cause $3.5 billion of harm to the United States government. His bondholders were wiped out by the failure of his institution. 20,000 bondholders also sued because the insolvency of Lincoln Savings and Loan had wiped out their positions. The amount of financial harm done to the Treasury of the United States and the individual citizens would seem to me, as a citizen who reads a lot of newspapers, that the total harm is likely to be enormous. An extremely sad aspect of the situation is that nobody on earth has been willing to make even a ballpark estimate as to what the total price tag of that harm would be. How can the various reform organizations in our country know how hard they should work to reform various aspects of potential corruption in the United States government, in particular the financing of political campaigns? How should they know how hard to exert themselves when no one on earth has even a ballpark estimate of how much harm is being caused by this system of financing political campaigns?
Yeah, my response to that is I have this theory that I think the real leverage point is with the donors themselves. My hope is that sufficient numbers of people who hold the wealth and sufficient numbers of powerful elected folks are tired of the system. That's where I think there's the most optimism in getting something done. If I were a nonprofit, I would be thinking really hard about the mega donors. It just doesn't seem like they think about it in those terms. It seems like they're thinking about campaign finance reform and really thinking about it very sort of as engineers of the system instead of going to the sources of power. What's your sense and what optimism do you have for the press? Because it seems like various publications have done a much better job at keeping a beat on where corruption might be happening. Individual journalists have done a really good job on this. But to your point, there's still a big gap in what we know. How would you grade the press in doing this work?
I don't know how I'd grade him, Nicholas, but certainly I have high hopes for all three of the segments that you have indicated. Chuck Lewis wrote a number of terrific books that should have motivated all three of the segments of our country to much greater activities than they have undertaken. Larry Mackinson wrote another series of pieces in line with what Chuck Lewis published. Both of them and others have indicated that there is tremendous corruptive potential through political campaign contributions. Unfortunately, none of the three segments have been sufficiently motivated to either affect important reforms or to come up with ballpark estimates of the amount of harm being done. One thing that's somewhat a basis of hope, if you read the New York Times, which I do, over the past 2 weeks, they have had a number of articles on the mayoralty race in New York City. They have focused on the most significant campaign donations to, right now, the leading candidate is Andrew Cuomo. Cuomo has gotten big bucks contributions from DoorDash and from the realtors of New York City. And in both cases, the New York Times raises its eyebrows and said, why are these donations being made? Should there not be significant ethical questions raised in connection with these campaign finance distributions? So the press is doing many good things, but the desired goal line still seems almost dishearteningly distant.
I hope that's a place where we can make a difference, where Querionian can make a difference. Part of my fear is if we come up with this estimate that once the figure is established and we give people more of a sense of how big that number is, the public wouldn't care that much. And that's the puzzle I'm really interested in. How do you get people to care about this? Because I actually think they do. It's a combination of hopelessness and maybe not presenting the information in the right ways that lead many people to think this is just the system we have. There's not much that can be done about it. If I had to focus on an area that I think all of these sectors would hopefully do a better job is in thinking about how do we get this information to the public in such a way that they actually care about it. Another segment that we haven't talked as much about are individual politicians. There are examples of politicians that make more of an issue of this and raise the questions. I think they can be very motivating to the public. I have a good deal of hope there. I also think that we're entering an era where the corruption has become much more public. I'm thinking about things like seeing industry in the White House and the current questions around the White House relationship to crypto and the fact that there seems to be large sums of money that individuals are going to benefit from, and we don't fully understand where it's coming from. We don't know the full amount. I think we're hopefully entering an era where the public maybe hasn't been thinking about these issues because it's been so hopeless, but suddenly it is the top headlines at the New York Times are thinking about the motivations of elected individuals, and should it really be okay that because it's happening out in the open, somehow it makes it better? And the answer is obviously no, but hopefully it will make a difference to people. So to wrap up, the final question that I have for you is on potential solutions. And because a lot of this does have to do with the way that campaigns are financed, right? And the fact that if you're somebody who wants to run and be elected, the number one priority for you is to figure out how you're going to run your race. It's really expensive to run an effective race. There are a number of different proposals that people float around. One of them is financing campaigns using public money, which many reformers have tried to develop proofs of concept of doing that municipally. We've seen, a number of examples of where that work is happening. Another reform idea is around the compensation of elected officials. There's a question of should elected officials make much more money such that they personally have fewer incentives to seek out payments from potential bad actors. Which of these ideas is most interesting to you? If you wouldn't mind sharing about where your reform preferences lie.
Well, one of my ideas, and I don't deserve any personal credit for it, is the idea that there be public financing of the media, social media, television, radio, and so on. I had a friend who unfortunately now is dead, who said that there is no corruption in Great Britain, this is when he said it to me, as a result of political campaign contributions. Basically, because every major party candidate by British law has automatic funding, free access to television, radio, and social media. This idea has been put forward in the United States. Illinois Senator Paul Douglas proposed it in the 1960s. Jimmy Carter was in favor of it somewhat later. And in the 1998 State of the Union address, Bill Clinton proposed this idea. Unfortunately, after Clinton's proposal, the idea of free airtime for political candidates had a half-life of maybe 7 days. And what happened was that the incumbent politicians and the media combined to kibosh the idea. So it was dead within a week. Mm-hmm. The television networks makes so much money off of political advertising, and incumbents don't want anything to happen that might give a leg up to potential challengers. So those two factors totally killed Clinton's proposal. I have almost not heard it mentioned in the 27 years since Clinton made that proposal. It seemed to a number of very smart people to be immensely appealing, but it's as dead as the proverbial doornail.
How hopeful are you in general that we'll see some change?
I have huge hopes, but so far they've been largely disappointed.
Yeah. But I will keep trying. To close out, this conversation, of course, was initially focused on Tweed, and you've spent a lot of time in Tweed's world and thinking about Tweed. You don't have a time machine, so you don't get to talk to him. I wonder if there was one question that you could ask him as somebody who spent a good amount of your time thinking about his trajectory. What would you ask him if you had him in front of you?
I will answer on one condition, Nicholas, and that is that you answered your own question after I answered.
Okay.
Tweed was in many ways a very smart guy. He had a terrific memory. He had terrific ways of interacting with a wide range of persons. He did a good job of recruiting figureheads for his ring. In other words, for the mayor of New York City and for the governorship of New York State, what Tweed basically did is he had sufficient voter understanding that the voters would want somebody who was at least superficially honest. So he had at least superficially men serve as mayor of New York and as governor of New York State. Given his astuteness in these things, I think that the question I would ask him is, there are in the book accounts of many Successor Rings, Successor Political Machines, the ring that was headed by William Tweed. And I think I would ask him which political machine and which political boss that came after him he would have greatest admiration for. I would speculate that his answers might be Thomas Pendergast, who was a successor boss in Missouri, and maybe the first Mayor Daley, Richard J. Daley in Chicago. But
And you think that based on why do you think you would pick those
well,
two?
because he was so interested in how do you create a tremendously effective political machine. And I think that was his primary interest, and I think that he would want to know that.
Yeah, I would want to ask him his genuine thoughts on the concept and the model of democracy. I would want to understand whether he thinks it's a fool's errand and whether he believes that authoritarianism makes more practical sense, or whether he believes that democracy is a worthwhile form of government that sometimes requires centralization of power to get more things done. I don't know what he would say. I mean, you've studied him. I wonder if he might say, if he was a cynic and would say, no, it takes a man like me to make the whole thing run, or he might say,
Yeah, I think he would say that corruption is inevitable, and he was overwhelmingly proud of what he did. He joined the government of Manhattan as an alderman in the 1850s. Tweed entered into a government that had an ethos of the members lining their own pockets. Tweed had a lot of kids. He wanted money for his family, and so he happily entered into the stealing in the government of New York City.
yeah. So in his case, it might have been, well, if this is the default system, if the default system is a system where everyone's amassing wealth, we might as well have somebody who is effective and also has some kind of civic inclinations. Yeah.
Yes.
So the book will be coming out soon. When can we expect it?
My publisher, McFarland, is not telling me.
All right. So they'll hold us in suspense until it comes out. But is that the cover? This is the cover? Okay. Cool. So coming to an Amazon near you will be The Boss in American Government, William Tweed, and his successors in corruption from the 1860s to today.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Mark Thompson. Hopefully this was an enjoyable first podcast experience.
Nicholas, I thank you for making the experience as exciting as it has been. I never knew which question was coming next.
Well, I hope that was okay.
That was fine. That's
Good.
the way it should be.
All right. Thank you.